Beethoven Symphony number 5. Probably the 4 most famous notes in the entirety of Western classical music. They've got all sorts of associations for us. V for victory, fate knocking at the door. There's a great story of Gustav Mahler rehearsing the opening few bars of this piece and going over those few bars again and again and again and again and some, to the extent that his musicians were completely frustrated and climbing up the wall. It is that sort of piece though, it gets under your skin, particularly with its rhythmic energy. Now I want to look at the opening, just the opening few bars, hopefully not going over and over to the extent that Mahler did. I want to look at those bars from the point of view of the conductor. Firstly, analysis. What does the conductor need to think? Secondly, the practice. What do we do when we pick up the baton? How do we transfer that analysis into the actuality of standing in front of an orchestra? Let me get one question out of the way immediately. The speed of the music. Beethoven writes beat equals 108. 108 beats per minute. That beat being the minim or the bar. He wrote that, of course, some years after he composed the piece. And there are all sorts of arguments, if you like, for and against Beethoven's metronome markings in general, for his symphonies, quartets, sonatas. I'm not going to rehearse those arguments now. They're interesting and worth looking into if you don't know them. The only thing I would say is, from the point of view of the conductor, all other things being equal, why not? Of course, all other things are not always equal. You have to consider the standard, the experience of your orchestra. You have to consider the acoustics of the building in which you're playing. But if those things are equal, why not give 108 a go? Okay, moving on. The most important thing to consider here are the pauses. There are 2. And I need to make a slight distinction here between the pause as written on the page and the pause as heard by the listener to the music. The question is, how long should the pauses be? A red light flashes as soon as I hear the word should. Prescriptive. And surely the whole point of a pause is that it signifies an indeterminate length of sound, by its very nature. The rhythm, the beat of the music ceases at the moment that the pause comes. It might create a moment of tension, of relaxation. There are all sorts of possibilities, but the point of the pause is that the beat ceases. So how can I ask the question, how long should it be? How long should they be? Let me play you the first few bars, counting out the bar numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The listener hears 2 pauses. The first is bar 2. The second is bars 4 and 5 combined. They are tied in the music. Now, why did Beethoven write bar 4? There can only be one answer, surely. He wanted the second pause sound to be perceptibly longer than the first one. And if that's the case, then the corollary is that the first pause in bar 2 should not be too long. If it is long, and then the second pause sound has just 1 bar added to that, especially if we're going at 108 or something similar, then the second pause will not be perceptibly longer than the first pause, which is surely Beethoven's point. Okay. Therefore, the first pause should not be long, and the second a little longer, noticeably so, but not massively so. Throughout most of the history of recorded sound, this piece has been recorded with long pauses. It would be interesting to go away and listen to a few recordings, old, new, traditional instruments, period instruments, and just compare different versions. Nowadays, some people do play it with shorter pauses along the lines I've been suggesting, but it would be interesting to hear the difference and also to hear what you like. Pauses themselves. There are three things to consider. One is getting to the pause. The second is on the pause itself. And the third thing is how do we get from the pause into the next bit of music. So the before, the on and the after. Getting to the pause is relatively straightforward, at least in this case. There are lots of cases where a pause is written in the music by the composer, but the conductor decides that in order for that pause to make sense, there has to be a little slow up, a bar or two perhaps, before the pause. Not that that is written necessarily by the composer. Whether or not that is the that is a good thing is a case-by-case decision. Sometimes it is, sometimes I don't think it is. However, here that's not an issue. We have 3 notes before the first pause, and to slow them down, well, is possible, but would feel a little bizarre, I would suggest. We would end up with something like this. So I would suggest that these first 4 notes need to be in time, rhythmically in time. So we hit the first pause in that type of manner. Okay, then there's the question of what do we do on the pause itself? Well, there are 2 options. We can have a determinate length or an indeterminate length. If it's a determinate length, what I mean is it will be a certain number of bars long in this case. So we could think that the pause is, let's say, 3 beats long, 3 bars long. So we have 2, 3, something along those lines. Or we could just be we could just be thinking of the length of the sound, the effect of the sound, and not a particular number of bars length. Both have their validity. I personally prefer the second. But the option is there and worth thinking about. The third thing, and the trickiest, if you like, of the 3 things, is what do we do at the end of the pause? There are 2 basic ways of continuing after a pause. One is we have no gap, the other is we have a gap. If we have no gap, then the sound of the pause, the end of the sound of the pause coincides with the beginning of the next bar of written music. There is no gap between those 2. If there is a gap, then of course the pause ends at some point and there's a gap before the next bit of music starts. That gap can itself be done in 2 ways. It could be a determinate length or an indeterminate length, in exactly the same way as I was talking about the length of the pause itself. Now, if there are 3 ways to end a pause, no gap, determinate gap, indeterminate gap, then in these first 5 bars where there are 2 pauses, you can see that there are 9 different ways in which you could combine those 3 possibilities. You could, for example, have no gap after the first pause, no gap after the second pause. No gap after the first pause, determinate gap after the second pause. No gap after the first pause, indeterminate gap after the second pause, and so on. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that each of those 9 possibilities is going to be equally satisfying, musical, either to the orchestra or to the audience. However, they are all possible. What I would suggest is that the way in which you decide to do these first 5 bars is the way in which you continue to do the pauses which recur throughout the movement. Of course, that's not a necessity. I forget how many pauses there are throughout the movement, but probably there are a sufficient number of them for you to do all 9 of those possibilities, or those combinations of pause exits. You'd confuse the hell out of your orchestra and probably some of your audience as well. But it's possible. Anyhow, that's really the end of this section of thinking about what Beethoven has written. I'm then going to make another video which will look into how we actually effect those things through the use of a baton.